This week, it's time to go west, young man. Or more at the time this site was set up, it was more likely to be get on a boat, go southwest, then due south until you can wave at the penguins, and then finally north with a western drift until you can finally go a little east and hit the Columbia River and finally land and get your feet dry. We are heading to the Fort Vancouver National Historic Site, an outpost set up by the Hudson's Bay Company following along in the wake of the exploration by Lewis and Clark and their Corps of Discovery a few decades earlier. The draw of this site in support of today's episode is specifically the recreation of Dr. Laughlin's 8-acre garden outside the stockade or wooden walls of the fort. This garden, with specimens from England and all over the British Empire and the rest of the world, is typical of the habits of the early Americans, to largely bring their food plants with them and have little regard for what might be growing in a place they arrive in. It's an odd thing about North America. It's full of cool botanical things, but the colonial and immigrant habit of bringing what you know with you means that even today, most of us in America have only a dim awareness of what plants are actually American. And this habit of mind and cultivation can be seen in the garden at a picturesque spot along the Columbia River, sitting on the border between the future states of Washington and Oregon. Fort Vancouver, the Hudson's Bay Company, and the garden are all emblematic of this period of war and adventure between 1776 and 1815 for young America. The hope, the ambition, and the looming uncertainty of the age are all here to be seen at this National Historic Site. Though most of the big events and alterations come after this period, the seeds for them were planted in the time we are currently studying. So to see the garden at its best, take a trip to the National Historic Site at Fort Vancouver in the summer, when, honestly, many of the East Coast sites I've mentioned are muggy and unpleasant, and the reputation for the area for growing glorious food can be thoroughly enjoyed. Episode 106, The Waning of Vegetables and Variety as America is on the Move. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at what happened to the American vegetable eating when much of the country was on the move for war and adventure. New homes were being traveled to, soldiers were tramping to new parts of the new country, and people were figuring out what traveled, both to be cooked on the road and to grow at the new home. To see how this looked in the dinner bowl of the period, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that for the marching soldier or traveling homesteader, along with the common laborer, American food developed an interesting or. Food could be plentiful or flavorful, but it rarely seemed to be plentiful and flavorful. If there was a lot of it, it would very often be not that tasty. Sure, there was a similar issue in England, home to many of the colonists and early immigrants, but not so much in France or Germany or Spain and many of the other principalities and dukedoms and other states that were sending people to these new American shores. So what was America's problem? Right off the bat, part of the problem was the man thing. Britain first and then America second had a habit of sending men off alone to do stuff with extremely sketchy ideas about how everyone was going to eat. They would go settle towns, set up tobacco plantations, cut trees, mine iron, fight the locals already living there, all the conquest, money-making, and adventure stuff. It's that conquering with no thought of governance that keeps getting people into trouble. Just ask Napoleon and Alexander and anyway. As records keep showing, war and adventure might be billed as man stuff, and the early pulp novels and movies sort of solidified the idea in the American mind. But the pesky archaeology shows that, all the same, women would come along or join in. But they'd usually be off the books, and their endeavors in cookery were poorly supported, if not generally ignored in the records and budgeting altogether. As we roll into the 19th century, it was a new age of extensive record keeping. But the records were generally geared towards making money, and so, due to its indirect connection to profit, there were often few records being kept about how exactly dinner happened, how much foraging, what gardening looked like, what herbs were dried, what went into what pickle, kitchen stuff. But people kept on getting dinner, so it was going on, and even if the number of published cookbooks were still scarce as hen's teeth, personal, handwritten, or manuscript cookbooks were happening. And that is where the real clues to the emerging new American cuisine really lie. If there's one thing I've done my best to make clear all the way through the 18th century and well into the 19th, unless it was a very fine house or castle, the cookery was women's work. Sure, large butchery was men's work, but all the chopping, prepping, baking, butter making, stewing, spicing, pickling, potting, and even some of the brewing, this was the work of the women. So when you don't bring women along, food suffers. The bread was rock hard or gummy or burnt. The meat was unseasoned, and the vegetables, unless they were a few simple things like dried peas or squash or dried apples, vegetables were largely missing. Usually there were no herbs, no local seeds or bark or roots for spices, foraging for mushrooms, for local tubers, for native berries, or for acorns and nuts and such things were right out. You can see it today in American culture around menu items named lumberjack breakfast or farmer's breakfast. They're big, but they're pretty plain. Other than syrup and ketchup and an occasional gravy, we seem to lack condiments, things with a variety of flavors. The size of the meals was entirely sensible given their origins and the, at least to the modern eye, fairly shocking amount of direct physical labor required of the people eating them. But lots of people all over the world were doing that much work, but they seemed to have more flavors at their fingertips. So what was up with this American plainness? The variety of all global cuisines lies in their plant foods, especially in the processing of those plants. Some meat processing, especially fermenting and other preservation methods, add to it. But the majority of the variety of global cuisines is in the vegetable matter. The pickling, the preserving, the flavorful leaves, the ground seeds, the delicate flowers, collected sap, toasted nut, dried barks, tubers, stems, and of course, the fruits. So first of all, gathering all that variety and the knowledge of what to get and how to preserve and prepare it, that was the woman's work in the rounds of what needed to be done. And second, it took local knowledge. To have variety, one must know about variety and then spend time and energy and mental space on pursuing variety. But when your aim is chasing out the locals, well, there goes the local knowledge. And even if women of discernment were able to spend time figuring out what was local food and what was local poison, in this age of war and adventure, expansion and conquest, what needed to be done to simply not just die of starvation and exposure, that did not really leave much time for foraging and exploration. An army on the march, a navy under sail, a troop on its way to a fort on the new border, or even families on their way to a new homestead in hopeful but unknown territory, really lacks time to sort out which berries are to be harvested and which are to be avoided, much less the time to wander off the trail and go find them. To supply armies and such, and to keep adventurers on the move, bulk foods that need limited preparation need to be found. And so it was in this time that America's contact and interest in local vegetation suffered a severe collapse. Up until now, America had been building up a repertoire of local goodies. It had started when those original Pilgrims and the other early colonists showed up who were super bad at farming and so desperate for food they were willing to eat anything, including those weirdo native crops, at least the ones that cooperated with European farming habits. The ones that grow in fields and you could plant in rows and they weren't too picky about their growing ground. And, possibly most importantly, they fit in as replacements for European eating habits. So that meant largely for the Europeans, they recognized corn, squash, and beans. They filled in for the grain, starchy vegetable matter, and beans base diet a lot of Europeans were coming from. The North American locals weren't only eating succotash and squirrel meat, and the immigrant Europeans weren't coming from a diet of just porridge, carrots, and lentils with a side of poached rabbit. They both were regularly foraging for seasonal vegetation. It was something people, mainly women, did on both sides of the Atlantic. The locals and now the colonial new arrivals. If you look at 17th century cookery books, there were plenty of references to things like cress and pot herbs and wild leeks and items from hedgerows like berries and sloes and so on. But when British people found themselves plopped down in an entirely new land, they seemed to have very little or no interest in speaking to the locals about deep foraging knowledge. And so the first best chance to get a real sense of what was around was lost. The early colonists occasionally would talk to the locals, but it seemed to be a lot about how they really needed to become Christians or maybe that they should be handing over more deer. All the same, as people settled into their homesteads and villages and seeds from back home made it over, the kitchen garden of the early American did expand. And the interesting American stuff picked up in those first hungry decades, they were folded in, especially if it felt like an analog for something missing from back home. Cranberry's an American berry if there ever was one. It did a good job of standing in for the European gooseberry. If anything, it dried and traveled better, and at some points and in some places became more popular. In fact, it was one of the first and remains one of the only North American sourced cash crops. Its cousin, the blueberry, is another, but that doesn't happen for a long time from now. Corn, obviously, its hardiness, adaptability, and relative ease to harvest compared to things like wheat and rice and all the other grains, millet, sorghum, quinoa, etc., made it a winner, both locally and globally, especially in places where people were feeding themselves as well as selling food abroad for money. But for the most part, even though we have a whole continent's worth of plants here, unless it was a moneymaker of some sort, we really cut ourselves off at the knees when it came to getting some new stuff for the cupboard or the spice cabinet. Once we stopped being on the edge of starvation, interest in local vegetation all but dried up. Seriously, look at the spices in your cupboard or in the spice aisle of your grocery store. How many of them originate in North America? In my spice shelf, and I'll admit it's abnormally well populated, I have filet powder from sassafras leaves and sour ground sumac berries, which, while they are a North American native, are currently most likely to be found in North African and Middle Eastern cuisine, where it often fills a role also held by sun-dried ground limes. It's a tartness typically added at the end of cooking. The Americas have their own flavors, but for whatever reason in North America, we were so intent on bringing the world here, we missed much of what was already present. And even when a food of the Americas did become popular, it was almost always filtered through other, more food-interested cultures. Strawberries, which are American, became popular in America once they had been cultivated and popularized by the French. Even though turkeys were native all over the Americas, it's the Mexican ones post-European tour that became the quintessential American turkey. Chocolate arrived in the U.S. only after taking the circle route to Spain and then England and picking up sugar. America didn't get tomatoes straight from South America. We only absorbed them after they went to Africa via the Portuguese and were introduced onto the American dinner table by enslaved cooks from West Africa. White potatoes went the long way as well, from the west coast of South America to Spain, then to England, and then were used to feed the Irish as they were pushed off their productive farmland in the name of cheap wheat for the British factory worker. The colonizers of North America and then the early Americans saw the land first as a place to be mined for sassafras and cod and furs and tobacco and timber and iron, and then using the soil to grow things like sugar and rice and indigo and wheat. America was initially a satellite of Europe and considered a blank slate to be dressed in the clothes of the rest of the world. But one can't entirely eliminate the vegetable existence of a place just by importing your apples and oreganos and lavenders. As time passed, women and families of many nations showed up and had to cook dinner. And when the ingredients of home weren't available, well, many a resourceful cook did find something to fill the gaps. The kales and the cabbages and the coleworts were replaced by American things that worked as both hearty and tender greens. Scuppernong grapes and blueberries would stand in for the plums of England. Sage and ramps would fill in for the left-behind marjoram and leeks. But all these things were wild. They grew where they grew and refused generally to move cooperatively into the kitchen garden. Which, as long as you're setting up village and shop and staying put, it works okay. But in this time of war and adventure, running around the country to fight and setting up crowded camps that obliterate the local landscape, or moving on to new territory to set up new homes, well, all that local figuring things out that people did goes poof. As people moved onwards to a new frontier, over a mountain range or across a wide river was pretty common, well, the vegetation would be different all over again. And even if the vegetation was more or less the same, finding the good foraging spots and possibly the new vegetation worth foraging was work all over again. Especially, and I cannot emphasize this enough, as the habit was to chase out any locals who might know such things. So while over the first 150 years or so of European occupation of the east coast of America resulted in this new hybrid Euro-American cuisine, the addition of cranberries and corn and turkeys to European fare, and the return of salmon and venison and wild goose to the common man's table, combined with, say, oniony ramps and sour rosehip tea, the years of war and adventure that we're in right now, 1776 to 1815, now there was a need to provide masses of food for masses of men. And the moving of so many people to new places caused that exploratory and expansive period of food figuring out to end. So even though America was becoming bigger, our use of vegetation native to North America actually began to contract. The very stability of the new country meant that importing those crops from the old country were more possible. Seeds for spinach and beets and turnips and asparagus and horseradishes were easy to pass around. Figuring out a domesticated ramp when onion slips from back home were doing nicely seemed like a silly waste of time. Oh, and as a kicker, the vision of a European America meant civilizing it. And if there was one thing that was decidedly uncivilized, it was getting one's food from the wild. Well, foraging had been an important and even essential part of early colonial eating. In the new America, the them versus us of expansion was being clarified. Them was the Indian or the original occupants of the land. Us were the nativists, the European-descended Americans who saw this land as theirs for the taking. And drawing lines and behaviors to make the distinction clear, them versus us, became part of the food scene. As a result, foraging, living off the native plant life that grew wild, that mostly became a them activity. We, the us in this dichotomy, were civilized, and we had farms and gardens. They were savages and foraged in the wild. And this turned out to be a particularly American way of thinking. As later immigrants from Germany, from Italy, even later immigrants from England, Ireland, and Scotland would be amazed at the American aversion to foraging from the rich offerings of the American landscape. Mushroom, greens, fruits, flowers, berries, flavorful roots were just all there for the taking. And the new Americans who saw themselves as the originals, well, the civilized originals, would pass up this perfectly edible stuff outside of the fences and only eat, mostly, what they grew themselves, not what was growing out there. And this will continue to happen in waves over and over again. As new immigrants come in, they will be baffled at the American aversion to foraging. Sure, it makes a little more sense now with leaded fuel and roadworks crews spraying hillsides to control vegetation and stuff. But the real killer of American foraging ended up being the forgetting. Oh yeah, and are very sturdy and even ongoing to this day to a certain extent. That suspicion of luxurious, complex, luscious food that takes a lot of time to make. There was the Puritan thing for sure. Many of those different Protestant weirdos from the earliest years had left their stamp of suspicion on cooking food that was a little too enjoyable. But not all the Protestant weirdos. Families from the turbulent areas that are now Germany who, please note, came as families to stay and live rather than to mine the place for quick riches, brought rich, complex cooking traditions with them. And so what has been boiled down in modern tourist brochures to, say, the 7 sweets and 7 sours, shoe fly pie, and scrapple is really, in the words of food historian William Woys Weaver, a culinary tradition based on local produce, wild foraged ingredients, and a respect for the living soil. So while these families that came to be known generally as the Pennsylvania Dutch, with their rich baking, picking, and preserving heritage, were keeping alive things like saffron bread, quince honey, schneck, that is, snail rolls that we just call cinnamon rolls, those long hunters that were out there shooting beavers and deer for pelts and buckskins were stumbling around on a diet of cornmeal and lard, with maybe an occasional venison backstrap or tongue. And the soldiers living in forts were skating the edge of scurvy with lousy wholemeal bread, salt pork, and just enough dried fruit in their plum duff to keep their teeth from falling out of their gums. If you want a real good picture of how these guys in the forts and boats and out hunting were eating, the Townsends YouTube channel has a great series on what a soldier and a sailor and a hunter typically would have been munching on at this point, and I'll leave the links in the show notes. But beyond the general suspicion of luxury food, there were 3 other things that would really do in the American interest in learning the local foods. The first is exhaustion. Setting up a whole new country in the hurry America seemed to be in meant developing local foods. There just wasn't time. Too many people were into fast money instead of a nice long-term dependable home. And when you're constantly pushing and never slowing down to enjoy stuff, people barely have the time to pass on the basics of traditional food preparation, and they certainly won't be developing new food traditions. And this can be seen, where men set off alone and women fill in later, or arrive in much smaller numbers. The height of cooking tradition is beans and bacon with a little maple syrup or molasses. But in those groups where women were regarded as an essential part of the travel crew, you end up with things like hickory nut datch, which is a nut-studded cornbread cake, or ground cherry pie, or sweet corn and pawpaw pudding, all dishes based on local North American produce. But since most early Americans were in the hurry up and get bigger and expand camp, American food styles based on European traditions got flattened and streamlined, rather than adjusted and expanded. So not only were few new things getting added, an awful lot was getting lost. The second thing that started the ironing out of American food into something flatter than it had been was the arrival of canning technology. The first canned foods were systematized by Nicholas Appert for Napoleon's troops around 1807. But every state with an army, especially those fighting the French, were ready to get in on the action. And as it spread, women lacking support and community were super excited to get some food that would last without their time and attention, as were the soldiers and sailors who saw their jam ration increase. And the third thing was the American abundance of sugar. Especially in conjunction with the appearance of canning technology, sugar-based preservation of vegetable matter was going to explode, either with the direct canning of jams and syrups, but it also made vinegar making easier. Instead of having to juice all the apples or grapes or peaches or whatever and then fermenting it to make vinegar, sugar water makes a very quick vinegar, which can be boosted in flavor with the addition of a few apples or raspberries or whatever. Once things slowed down a little, and people, especially women, can get back to having a garden and sussing out the local vegetation, local cuisines will continue to develop and variety will grow some. But it will mostly be due to the vegetable variety brought in from the outside, instead of sorting through the abundance growing right here at home. In fact, next season we'll dive deeper into how variety in American food almost always meant, look at what I brought home from my trip abroad. So next time, and yep, we're getting into that time of year when I have to go skipsies. Every other week is going to be the order of the day, likely until after New Year's. Though I may get in some bonus episodes since they don't require so much research and depend more on stuff already in my head. Anyway, next time, it's going to be a look at the big starchy vegetables of American food and how they played their part in American expansion. Pumpkins and other winter squash, white potatoes and sweet potatoes. I really have to come up with a better distinguisher for the non-sweet potatoes because they aren't white. But I'll get into the naming problem as well next time. Thanks for listening. Any email quibbles or questions will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episode helps me know you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least that you find it interesting. I'm also doing a deep dive into the 19th century with co-host Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength in our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. It's still food, but now with fashion, fighting, and fraud. Well, okay, straight up crime. Lots and lots of crime. It's much sillier, but also a bit sweary, so not quite so E for everyone. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta as @THOAFood, but alas, I'm all X'd out. All this information, including book recommendations and video clips, will be available in the show description.